The auctioneer stopped mid-sentence and looked into the mud behind Otto Fenner's corn crib at a wooden crate half sunk beside a stack of rusted implement wheels. 40 men in Carhartt jackets stood in a rough half-circle around him, the last of the April frost still white in the low places. He read the lot aloud in the tone a man uses when he wants the crowd to know he considers the next 30 seconds a personal apology. A 3-gallon crock with a hairline crack from lip to base. A 2-gallon with the handle broken clean off. A 5-gallon that had lost its lid before the First World War and had since served as sleeping quarters for something with fur. A voice from the back rolled through the cold air. "You can keep it, Palmer." The laughter that followed moved through the crowd like wind through wheat, easy, satisfied, cruel in the way a small county can be cruel without meaning to. Then a woman near the middle of the crowd raised her hand. 450. Heads turned. She was 31 years old, in a wool work coat, with the collar turned up, her yellow hair pinned tight beneath a knit cap. Nobody bid against her. She walked to the crate, slid her arms beneath the wet boards, and lifted it herself while 2 men near the fence made a show of watching her do it wrong. A big man in a sheepskin collar tipped his hat theatrically at her departing truck and told the crowd they had just witnessed the finest transaction of the spring. The laughter came back louder. It rolled out of the mud yard into the truck cabs along the county road, and by Sunday it had spread across the parking lot of First Lutheran Church. What none of them knew was that she had been preparing for that crate for 8 months, and that a 2-story brick bank on the corner of Vine Street was already turning its attention toward her. The spring of 1959 came to Fayette County, the way it always came slow. Wet the black dirt still holding winter in its lower inches, the cottonwoods along the Volga River just beginning to show green at their tips. On the last Saturday of April, the estate of a man named Otto Fenner went to auction in the mud behind his barn, 4 miles south of West Union, on a piece of gravel road that had been graded twice that spring already, but still swallowed a tire up to the hub if a man wasn't careful where he pointed his truck. The auctioneer was a thorough man from OL Wine by the name of Palmer Reichelt, and thorough men do not skip lots merely because a lot is embarrassing. So when he reached the wooden crate behind the corn crib, half sunk in the mud, beside a stack of rusted implement wheels, he stopped, wiped his forehead with the back of a wrist, read from his clipboard in the tone a man uses when he wants the crowd to know. He considers the next 30 seconds a personal apology. 3-gallon salt-glazed stoneware hairline crack from lip to base. 2-gallon with the handle broken clean off, chip the size of a silver dollar along the shoulder. 1 gallon with a split down the bottom that some previous owner had filled with what appeared to be black roofing tar. A half-gallon in 2 pieces held together, as Palmer put it, mostly by habit. A 5-gallon that had lost its lid before the First World War and had since served, judging by the residue on the interior wall, as sleeping quarters for something with fur that preferred the dark. Palmer paused. He looked at the crate. He looked at the crowd, which numbered perhaps 40 men in Carhartt jackets, 2 women standing near the pickup line. $5 for the lot. A voice from the back, rough with cold and cigarette smoke. "You can keep it, Palmer." The laughter that followed was the easy laughter of men who were pleased to have found something to laugh about on a raw April morning. It moved through the crowd like wind through wheat, then settled. A woman near the middle of the crowd raised her hand. 450. That was the first time most of the men present had heard Elsa Halverson speak that morning, several of them turning to look because she had not been standing where they expected a bidder to stand. She was in her wool work coat, the collar turned up against the wind, her yellow hair pulled back tight beneath a knit cap, a pair of leather choring gloves stuffed in her left pocket. 31 years old, unmarried, running 160 acres of black dirt on the north side of the county alone since her father had passed 3 winters back. Palmer looked at her. He looked at the crate. He looked back at her. 450 going once. Nobody bid against her. 450 going twice. Sold to the lady in the gray coat. She walked to the crate, squatted beside it, slid her arms beneath the wet boards. 2 men near the fence made a show of stepping forward, then a show of watching her lift it herself, the way a man will watch a woman do a thing wrong when he does not intend to help her do it right. She carried the crate to the tailgate of her 1954 Ford, set it down without any grunt or shudder, walked back for the loose lids, loaded those too. She wiped her hands on a rag from her coat pocket. She started the truck. She drove north on the county road toward home, with the Crocks rattling in the bed. The radio switched off the way she always drove when she was working something out in her head. From the back of the crowd, a big man in a sheepskin collar, Merle Ostergaard, who farmed 600 acres over near West Union and never let anyone forget the number, tipped his hat theatrically toward the departing truck. Fellows, we have just witnessed the finest transaction of the spring. $4.50 cash on the barrelhead for what appears to be a raccoon's summer home. The laughter came back louder that time. It rolled across the mud yard, over the fence, along the road, into the truck cabs on their way home. By Monday morning, it had reached the co-op in Grundy Center. By Tuesday, it had reached Danner's Feed. By Wednesday noon, it was resting comfortably at the counter of the 3rd Street Cafe. By Sunday, it had spread across the parking lot of First Lutheran Church, and by the time it had made that journey, it had grown a raccoon, a bidding argument, a woman crying in her truck, none of which had happened. Though the laughter that carried the story was real, was wide-covered Fayette County like a thin, cold frost. To make sense of what Elsa Halverson did with that crate, and of everything she did after, a person has to understand who taught her to see what other people threw away. That means going back a generation to a machinist shop behind a farmhouse on the north side of the county, to a man named August Halverson, who had built the shop with his own hands in the summer of 1934. August had come out of the Norwegian settlements around Decorah, the son of immigrants who had crossed in the 1880s and worked their way west from the river towns to the black dirt country. He had learned machining at a shop in Waterloo through the worst years of the Depression, riding a train down on Sunday nights, riding back on Friday afternoons, sending 3/4 of every paycheck home to keep the mortgage current on the quarter section his own father was trying not to lose. When the farm was stable again and August took over from his aging father in 1938, he brought his tools home in the bed of a Model T truck. He built a shop behind the house with a concrete floor he mixed, and poured himself a wood stove salvaged from a schoolhouse that had burned in Clayton County, a lathe he had bought used from a widow in Cedar Falls for $30 cash, and rebuilt over the course of a single winter, working by kerosene lamp after the milking was done. That lathe was still running in 1959. It would still be running when Elsa was an old woman. August Halverson had a philosophy about material things. I did not believe in worthless. He believed in misidentified. He said it so often that Elsa could recite it before she was 7 years old, the words coming out in the flat vowels of the Norwegian-inflected English he had grown up speaking. What somebody else can't use and you can is the same as money, except you don't have to earn it twice. He said it about salvaged steel he pulled from the burn pile at the co-op yard. He said it about cracked leather harness he cut down, restitched by lamplight in November evenings. He said it about fence posts pulled from row crop ground being cleared for corn. He said it about a broken cast iron cook stove that he rebuilt into a shop heater in 1944 that still put out heat on a January morning 15 years after. He said it about everything, he meant it about everything, and Elsa listened. She was the second of 4 children. She was the only one who stayed. Her older brother Redar had gone to Cedar Rapids in 1946 and taken a good position with Quaker Oats, sending money home every Christmas in an envelope with a company return address. Her younger brother had gone to Des Moines and worked as an underwriter for an insurance office. 2 children, a brick bungalow on a paved street, a Ford Fairlane he traded in every 4th year. Her youngest brother had stayed on the farm 2 years after August's passing, then sold his 1/4 share of the inheritance to Elsa for a figure that was fair to him, fair to her, that left no bitterness between them, which was the best outcome the Halverson family had ever managed on the question of divided property. Elsa had been running the operation since 1953, when August's hands had started giving him trouble when the arthritis had begun to make the fine work at the lathe more painful than he would admit. She had been running it alone since he had gone in his sleep in November of 1956, at 68 years of age, in the upstairs bedroom of the farmhouse he had been born in. She had been 28 then. She was 31 when she bought the Crocks. What she had inherited apart from the land itself was a farm that carried no debt. August had paid the mortgage current in 1949, had never taken on another one, because he considered borrowed money the most expensive kind a person could carry. She had inherited this shop, which held 40 years of accumulated tools, some of them older than August himself, a set of Starrett calipers that had belonged to his father, a Stanley plane from 1898 that still cut a clean shaving on white oak, a drill press her father had assembled from parts he had traded a Cedar Falls machinist for in 1941. She had inherited the workbench August had built from oak, salvaged out of a barn that had come down in a straight-line wind north of Sumner. The south-facing window above that bench, which caught the morning light in a way that made a person want to stand there and work, whether there was work to do or not. She had inherited finally a savings account at the Fayette County State Bank in the amount of $4,200, which was every dollar August Halverson had not spent on the farm or on his family across 30 years of careful living. He had opened the account in 1926 with a deposit of $11. He had made a deposit into it every quarter for the next 3 decades in amounts ranging from $4 to $83, depending on the corn price in the year and how many times the tractor had needed a new head gasket. Elsa treated that account with the same reverence she treated the lathe. It was something that had been earned twice, once in the sweat of the earning, once in the discipline of the not spending, and she considered it something that should not be spent carelessly. She was not a woman who moved on impulse. She was a woman who considered a thing for a long, quiet season before she acted on it, and she had learned from August that the difference between a hunch and a plan was usually just the matter of whether anybody else knew about it yet. She kept her thinking to herself. She kept her ledgers current. She got up at 4 in the morning. She went to bed at 9 at night. She did not particularly care what the men in the co-op parking lot thought of any of it. When Elsa Halverson looked at that crate behind Otto Fenner's corn crib, she did not see garbage. She did not see a raccoon summer residence. She did not see $4.50 of embarrassment that would have to be explained to somebody on the drive home. She saw fermentation capacity, a winter's worth of food, the grocery money going into the bank instead of going out to a canning factory in the state of Illinois. What she saw had been 8 months in the making. Elsa had a card at the Grundy Center Public Library, and she used it the way August had used his tools, methodically with a specific purpose, until she had extracted from a subject everything useful. Through the fall and winter of 1958, she had read her way through the library's small holding on food preservation. She had read a University of Wisconsin extension pamphlet on lactic fermentation that dated to 1937. She had read a bulletin out of the Iowa State College experiment station on the salt curing of pork on the making of country ham. She had read a book by a woman in Vermont on the old New England ways of putting up beans and cabbage in stoneware. She had read a slim volume from the 1890s that a librarian had brought up from the basement, its pages foxed and its binding loose on the German cellar traditions of the settlers who had come into eastern Iowa in the 1850s. She had read all of that because she had been thinking about the grocery bill. The economics interested her more than any of the technique. A 3-gallon crock of properly fermented sauerkraut cost the labor of a single autumn afternoon, plus the price of coarse salt. A tin can of factory sauerkraut at the IGA in Grundy Center cost 19 cents, held approximately 1 pound of shredded cabbage, tasted in Elsa's estimation like something that had been made by a machine that was not paying attention. Multiply that 19 cents across a winter of meals. Multiply it across a decade. Multiply it across the difference between what a farm could produce and what a factory somewhere in Peoria was selling back to the farmer's wife at 4 times what it had cost to make. She had a garden. She had always had a garden because August had always had a garden, because a garden on a place that size was not a hobby, but a line item in a food budget that made the difference between a savings account that grew and a savings account that stood still. But she had been thinking about scale. She had been thinking about what it would look like to put up not 6 quarts of pickles for the year, but 60. Not a bushel of cabbage, but 10. Not a supplement to the grocery bill, but a replacement for most of it from the first hard frost in October through the last thaw in April. When the ground was iron, the garden was memory. The store in town was the only alternative for anybody who had not planned ahead. The problem was the crocks. Fermentation at that scale required stoneware. Stoneware in 1959 cost real money. A new 3-gallon salt-glazed crock at the hardware store in West Union ran $1.25. A 5-gallon ran $2.10. To do what Elsa had in mind, she needed a minimum of 30 gallons of capacity. 60 would give her a comfortable margin. Buying that capacity, new at the hardware store, would cost her somewhere between $12 and $25 depending on the sizes. $12 was not a catastrophic sum for a woman with $4,000 in the bank. But Elsa had decided in that quiet way, she decided things that she was not going to spend $12 on stoneware when the county was full of stoneware that people had stopped seeing. She had been watching the estate sales. Since the previous September, she had been to 4 of them, 1 in Bremer County, 2 in Fayette, 1 over the line in Clayton. She had noted at every sale that the sound crocks went for a nickel or a dime, that the cracked ones went for nothing at all or were passed over entirely left in the barn to be hauled off by whoever bought the miscellaneous farmyard scrap. She had bought 3 sound Crocs in the course of those 4 sales for a total outlay of 60 cents. She had bought them not because she needed them yet, but because she wanted to test something. What she had tested was the theory that a cracked crock was not necessarily a broken crock. She had taken a 2-gallon crock with a hairline running from the lip down through the shoulder, filled it to within 2 inches of the top with cold water from the pump, set it on the concrete floor of the shop for 48 hours in September of 1958. The hairline had wept 2 tablespoons in that time, then stopped. She had emptied the crock, dried it, packed it with shredded cabbage from the garden and coarse salt from a 50-pound bag, weighted the top with a scalded dinner plate, plus a clean river stone from the creek on the back 40, covered it with a clean square of muslin. She had put it in the northwest corner of the root cellar, where the temperature held steady in the low 50s, left it for 3 weeks, checking it every 3rd day for the yeast bloom on the surface that the Wisconsin pamphlet had warned her about. The hairline had not worsened. The cabbage had fermented perfectly. The crack under the compression of packed vegetables in the absence of liquid pressure was not a flaw. It was a feature that nobody else in Fayette County wanted to deal with. That fact was the reason she had bid $4.50 at the Fenner sale, had not blinked, had not bid against anyone, because there was nobody there who understood what she was buying. The laughter that spread across the county through the following week was the sound of 40 men and their wives misreading a situation for which they had not been given the necessary information. Elsa let them laugh. She had her Crocs. She had her plan. She had 8 months of quiet preparation stacked behind her like split cordwood. The men laughing at the counter of the 3rd Street Cafe would find out what they had been laughing at when the cellar was full and the check was written, or they would never find out. And in either case, it did not change what she intended to do next. The following Wednesday, Elsa drove into West Union to make her monthly deposit of the egg money and to draw $30 in cash against a coming purchase of coarse salt from the co-op. She parked the Ford on Vine Street across from the courthouse, set her purse under her arm, walked the block and a half to the Fayette County State Bank, a 2-story brick building on the corner with a Palladian window on the 2nd floor, a set of double doors of solid quarter-sawn oak that had been hung when Grover Cleveland was still in office. The teller she usually saw, a woman named Ellen, who had known Elsa since Elsa was a girl, was not at her window that morning. In her place stood a young man from Waterloo, whom Elsa did not recognize, in a suit that fit him poorly across the shoulders. He counted her deposit, wrote her a receipt, counted out her $30 in fives and singles, slid the cash across the marble counter. How was polite. He did not know her. She had turned to leave when a voice from the office at the back of the lobby caught her by the sleeve of her attention. "Miss Halverson, might I trouble you for a moment?" Clarence Whitmore was 52 years old that spring. He wore his silver hair combed straight back from a high forehead, his tie in a small hard knot, a fountain pen in the breast pocket of a gray suit that had been made for him in Dubuque. I had run the West Union branch of the bank since 1948. He carried himself the way men carry themselves, who have never in their working lives been told no, in a room they controlled. He wore a smile that did not extend as far as his eyes. He held the door of his private office open, gestured toward a leather chair opposite his desk. Elsa hesitated. She stepped in. He closed the door behind her, walked around the desk, sat down, folded his hands. On the wall behind him hung an oil portrait of the bank's founder, a man in mutton chops from the 1870s. Beneath the portrait, a framed certificate from the Iowa Bankers Association. "I have been wanting a word since I heard about the Fenner sale." His voice had the practiced warmth of a man who had told other people what was good for them. So many times he no longer noticed the taste of the words in his mouth. "I hope you will not think me impertinent, but your account is one I take a personal interest in. Your father was a customer of this bank for 30 years. I owe him the courtesy, and I owe you the same." Elsa said nothing. She sat with her purse in her lap, her hands folded on top of it, her back straight against the leather. A 160-acre farm is a considerable operation for a single woman to manage without assistance. I mean no disrespect by that observation. I have watched several women in your circumstance across my time at this bank. Women left with land after a husband or a father passed on. I have seen the ones who did well and the ones who did not. I have some idea of the difference between them. Elsa waited. Whitmore's smile widened by a quarter inch. I have been in correspondence with your brother Redar down in Cedar Rapids. He and I have had 2 conversations on the telephone since the winter. He has expressed some concern as any brother would. He and I have discussed what might be a prudent arrangement for the family's holdings going forward. The floor did not move beneath her, but something in the room shifted the way a barn shifts on a settling foundation, a fractional adjustment that a person feels through the soles of their feet before they consciously register it. Elsa's hands did not tighten on her purse. Her expression did not change, but she was at that moment reassembling in her mind everything she had assumed about how business in the county was actually conducted. Redar and I have arrived at what I consider a very sensible proposal. Whitmore opened a leather folder on his desk, turned a typed sheet of paper toward her. The 40 acres on the south side of your property, the piece along the county road with the good road frontage, would come to this bank as collateral against a small operating line of credit. Not because you would need the credit necessarily, but because the arrangement would put a professional set of eyes on the operation, would give the family the comfort of knowing there is a mechanism in place if a difficult season should arise. The typed sheet had a dollar figure at the bottom. Elsa did not lower her eyes to read it. She looked at Whitmore. She looked at the portrait behind him. She looked back at Whitmore. My brother did not ask my permission to have that conversation. I would not describe it as requiring permission, Miss Halverson. He is family. I am your banker. It is the ordinary course of business. It is not the ordinary course of my business. Whitmore's smile shifted. It did not falter, but it made a small adjustment the way a man's face adjusts when he realizes the conversation he prepared for is not the conversation that is actually taking place. He folded his hands again. I understand this must feel sudden, but I would ask you to consider in the quiet of your own kitchen this evening, what would happen to that farm in the event of a bad year? A hailstorm, a drop in the corn price, an illness. You have no husband, you have no children. There is nobody standing behind you if a season turns against you. Elsa opened her purse. She removed the receipt for her deposit, folded it, tucked it into the inside pocket of her wool coat. She closed the purse. She stood. Mr. Whitmore, my father opened his first account at this bank in 1926. He paid off the mortgage on the farm in 1949. He never took another dollar from this bank or from any other in the 7 years between then and his passing. He taught me that borrowed money is the most expensive kind a person can carry because you pay for it twice, once in the money itself, once in what it costs you to be the sort of person who has borrowed it. I intend to conduct my affairs the way he conducted his. She turned toward the door. Whitmore did not rise. Miss Halverson. He said her name in the tone of a man who was not accustomed to being walked away from. Please understand, this offer will not remain available indefinitely. Markets change. The bank's interests change. I would hate to see you come to us in 5 years and 10 years, in some difficulty to have to explain that the door you are standing in front of today is one you closed yourself. She had her hand on the brass doorknob. She turned back. Mr. Whitmore, if in 5 or 10 years I come to this bank in any circumstance whatsoever it will be to make a deposit, not to ask a favor. She opened the door. She walked through the lobby. She walked out onto Vine Street into the raw April light, did not stop walking until she had crossed to her truck, did not start the engine until she had counted once the $30 in her coat pocket to make sure it was still there. She sat in the truck for a full minute with her hands on the steering wheel. Then she drove out to the co-op, bought not $30 worth of salt, but 50 pounds more than she had planned to buy because she had understood sitting in that leather chair in front of that oil portrait that the Fenner Crocks were the beginning of something and not the end of it, that a person who understood what a cracked crock was for had better start acquiring more of them faster than she had originally intended. Word of the Fenner purchase had reached West Union by the time Elsa left the bank that Wednesday. Word of what she had bought at the Fenner sale of what a cracked stoneware crock full of raccoon nesting material was worth to a person who had $4.50 to waste had been the subject of some entertainment at the counter of the 3rd Street Cafe for the better part of 2 weeks by then. Elsa knew this. She did not particularly care. What she did care about was the coffee at the cafe, which was better than the coffee at the drugstore across the street, the pie which Marta Cole baked on Sunday mornings and put in the pie case at 6 a.m., which was usually gone by noon. The following Sunday, after the second service at First Lutheran, Elsa drove into town in her Sunday coat and her Sunday hat and pulled the Ford up in front of the cafe. She walked in. She took her usual stool at the counter, the third one from the door. She ordered a cup of coffee, a slice of rhubarb. The cafe was half full. Marta Kolb was working the counter. In the corner booth, Merle Ostergaard sat with three other men from the West Union Feed Dealers Association. Their coffee cups half empty in front of them, the Sunday register spread across the table. Ostergaard was in his church suit, which fit him too tightly around the middle, his face already flushed from the walk over from the Lutheran church at the top of the hill. He had spotted Elsa the moment she came through the door. Marta brought the coffee. Marta brought the pie. Elsa unfolded her napkin, set it in her lap, picked up her fork. Ostergaard stood up from the corner booth. He picked up his coffee cup. He raised it in Elsa's direction with the exaggerated gesture of a man proposing a toast at a wedding. "Gentlemen, if I might have your attention." The men at his table smiled. The two other tables in the cafe looked up. Marta paused with a coffee pot in her hand. "I would like us all to take a moment this fine Sabbath morning to recognize the finest business transaction concluded in Fayette County so far this spring. $4.50 cash on the barrelhead for a crate of what I believe the technical term would be, of what my grandmother would have called for its intended purpose. Well, let us just say that the raccoon population of the county has been made homeless by this remarkable act of commercial acumen. Let us wish the new proprietress every success in the sauerkraut business she is no doubt about to launch." He was grinning. His companions were grinning. From two tables over, a man in a Mackinaw laughed and slapped his knee. The two women in the window booth exchanged a look that Elsa could not read from where she sat, though she caught the shape of it in the mirror behind the counter. Elsa lifted her coffee cup. She took a sip. She set the cup down. She cut a piece of the rhubarb pie with the edge of her fork, lifted it, chewed, swallowed. She did not turn her head toward Ostergaard. The laughter held for another beat. Then it started to run thin because laughter that is not being answered begins to feel foolish very quickly. Ostergaard was still standing in the middle of the cafe with his coffee cup raised and no target giving him anything to work with. He tried again, a note lower. "Miss Halverson, we were all wondering, have you settled on a name for the operation? Halverson's Fine Fermented Products, perhaps. The Fenner Estate Kraut Company." The man in the Mackinaw laughed again, but the laugh was already thinner. Marta Kolb set the coffee pot down on the burner. Her mouth was a straight line. Elsa finished her pie. She finished her coffee. She wiped her mouth with the napkin, folded the napkin, set it beside the plate. She reached into her purse. She counted out 35 cents, laid the coins in a small stack on the counter, added a nickel on top of the stack for Marta. She picked up her purse. She stood. She turned then. She looked at Merle Ostergaard for the first time since he had begun speaking. She held the look for perhaps 3 seconds. She did not smile. She did not scowl. Her face was as expressionless as the face of a woman studying a weather report in the newspaper. "Mr. Ostergaard." The man's name landed in the room the way a stone lands on a wooden porch. "I hope you have a pleasant Sunday." She walked out. The bell above the door rang once as it closed. Merle Ostergaard stood in the middle of the cafe with his coffee cup still half raised. His face went from red to a deeper red. He sat down. Nobody at his table spoke for a long moment. Then one of the feed dealers cleared his throat, said something about the weather. The conversation resumed at a lower volume than before. The two women in the window booth looked at each other again. The smaller of the two women, who was Ingrid Voss, wife of Thorvald Voss, who farmed the quarter section east of Elsa's place, watched Elsa's Ford pull away from the curb through the window. Something in Ingrid's face was working out a calculation she had not previously thought to make. Elsa drove 3 blocks down Vine Street. She turned east on Highway 18. Instead of going home, she pulled into the parking lot of the West Union Hardware and Feed. She sat in the truck for a full minute with the engine off. Then she got out. She walked into the hardware store. She walked past the paint counter and the plumbing fittings and the display of galvanized buckets. She stopped in front of the stack of 50-pound bags of pickling salt near the back wall. There were 17 bags in the stack. She counted them. She walked to the counter. She asked George Detweiler, who had been running the hardware store since 1946, whether he could deliver 8 of those bags to her place on Tuesday. George looked at her over his reading glasses. 8 bags, Miss Halverson. That is 400 pounds of salt. I know what it is. Tuesday morning, if you can manage it. Set them inside the shop door. I will pay you when you drop them. George Detweiler wrote the order on his pad. He did not ask what she wanted with 400 pounds of pickling salt. He had known August Halverson for 30 years. He was not a man who asked questions when a Halverson placed an order. Elsa walked out to her truck. She sat behind the wheel. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel. She was not shaking. She was not upset. She had made in the space of the 6 minutes between Ostergaard's toast and her walking into George Detweiler's hardware store, a decision that would double the scale of everything she had planned for the coming year. She had made it without any drama at all. She had made it because she had understood, sitting on that stool at the counter, that the men laughing at her were not going to stop laughing until she gave them a reason to stop. That the reason would not be an argument or an explanation, but a full root cellar and a bank account they could not begin to imagine. She started the truck. She drove home. Tuesday morning, George Detweiler pulled his delivery truck up to the shop door and unloaded 8 50-pound bags of pickling salt onto the concrete floor, stacked them along the north wall in 2 rows of 4. Elsa paid him $32 in cash. She thanked him. She closed the shop door behind him after he drove out. She stood for a moment in the cold shop, listening to the quiet, looking at the crate of Fenner Crocks she had set on the concrete floor next to the workbench 3 days before and had not yet touched. She started with the 5-gallon. She lifted it out of the crate. She set it on the bench under the south window where the morning light was strongest. She turned it slowly through a full rotation, running her thumb along the rim, feeling for chips she had not noticed at the sale. There were 2 she had missed. Neither compromised the wall. The interior was, as Palmer Reichelt had accurately described, disgusting. She carried the crock out to the yard, tipped it upside down, banged it against the side of the shop until the loose material fell out. She brought it back inside. She filled it with boiling water from the shop stove, added a cup of lye from a can under the bench, let it sit until the water had cooled to warm. She scrubbed the interior with a long-handled brush she used for cleaning the milk cans. She rinsed it 3 times. She set it upside down on the bench to dry. Then she picked up the lid problem. The 5-gallon had lost its original stoneware lid before the First World War. Palmer Reichelt had noted the fact in his catalog. No bidder in Fayette County had considered the crock usable because of it. Elsa considered a lid the least of a crock's problems. Under the workbench in a stack her father had put there in 1948 were 6 boards of quarter-sawn white pine air-dried for 11 years, which August had held on to for reasons he had never bothered to explain, which she had never disposed of because she had absorbed his conviction that a person did not throw out good wood. She took a board down. She measured the interior diameter of the crock at the shoulder. She marked a circle with a compass. She cut the circle out with a coping saw, working slowly, keeping the blade square to the surface. She sanded the edge smooth with a block. She melted a lump of beeswax wax from the 2 hives she kept at the edge of the south garden in a shallow tin on the shop stove, brushed the melted wax onto both faces of the pine disc and along the cut edge. When the wax cooled, it left the wood sealed against the brine that would rise around it during fermentation. She set the lid on top of the 5-gallon crock. It fit within 1/16 of an inch on all sides. The cost of that lid, when she added up the pine, the wax, the coping saw blades she had already owned, came to nothing at all. She moved on to the 2-gallon with the missing handle. The handle had broken off cleanly at the shoulder, leaving 2 stub attachment points where the original handle had joined the wall. She measured. She cut a length of galvanized fence wire from a spool by the door, doubled it, twisted it through the stub attachments, formed a loop, wrapped the loop with a strip of leather cut from an old harness in the tack shed. The result was functional, would remain functional through as many liftings as she required of it. She had cut the wire from a spool that had been in the shop since 1953, the leather from a harness August had brought home from a farm sale in Sumner in 1950. She wrote it in her ledger as 0. The 1-gallon with the tar repair got a careful inspection under the south window with a magnifying lens August had used for reading fine machine work. The tar had been applied by a person who understood tar. It had been troweled into the crack from the inside, then smoothed with what appeared to be the back of a spoon, then allowed to cure for what must have been days before the crock was returned to service. She filled the crock with water, set it on the bench for 3 days. It did not weep a drop. She wrote it in her ledger as sound. The 3-gallon with the hairline was already proven. She set it aside. The 1/2-gallon in 2 pieces did not become a fermentation vessel. It became something else which August would have understood without any explanation from her. She wrapped the 2 halves in a burlap sack, struck them once with a 2-pound hammer on the concrete floor of the shop. The pieces broke into 8 or 10 fragments of varying size. She set the fragments in a wooden crate on a shelf by the door. In April, she would take them out to the garden and press them into the soil around the base of each row of lettuce, sharp edges, up to keep the slugs from crossing over into the tender leaves. That was what her grandmother had done in the 1890s. That was what August's mother had done in the 1870s. The half-gallon crock was not garbage. It was the next generation of slug fencing. By the end of the day, Tuesday, Elsa had cleaned, repaired, sealed every crock from the fenner crate. She had spent no money at all on the repairs beyond the $32 for the salt. The salt was not a repair. She had in her cellar and shop combined 22 gallons of fermentation capacity that the county had considered trash. By the following Sunday, when she went to a farm dispersal sale in Bremer County and picked up 2 more crocks nobody would bid on for 15 cents apiece, she had 27. Wednesday evening, after the shop work was finished and the chores were done, and the kitchen was clean, and the fire in the parlor stove was down to coals, Elsa sat at the oak drop-leaf table by the south window of the front room with the ledger open in front of her and a no. 2 pencils sharpened to a fine point in her right hand. Outside, the light was going out of the sky in the long, slow way it did in Iowa. In the middle of April, the fields beyond the road still holding their brown, the windbreak on the west line black against the last of the color above the horizon. She had on the table beside the ledger 3 things. The first was the passbook to her savings account at the Fayette County State Bank, showing a balance of $4,218 as of the last posting. The second was a leather billfold she had used since 1954, the corners softened from a decade of pocket wear, the stitching along the fold beginning to give. The third was a single sheet of lined paper she had torn out of the back of the ledger, folded once along the horizontal. She sat with the pencil in her hand for a long time. She was not composing. She had composed the words during the drive home from West Union on Sunday afternoon, had held them in her head through the salt delivery Tuesday, and the shop repairs, and the milking. Wednesday morning, by Wednesday evening, the words had gone through their final revision without her having written a syllable of them down. She wrote them out now. She wrote in the small, tight hand August had taught her when she was 7, the letters upright and clear, each one distinct from the next. 1959. Balance $4,218. Goal: sufficient cash on hand to purchase 160 acres of Fayette County farmland at fair market value in full, without borrowing a dollar from any bank or any person before the year I turn 55. Outside her window in the shop across the yard, 27 crocks stood in a row on the concrete floor, waiting for the September cabbage, waiting for a plan they knew nothing about and could not have been laughed at for if they had. The first cabbage went into the crocks on the 14th of September, a Monday morning that broke clear and cold over Fayette County, with frost lying white in the low places along the creek bottoms. Elsa was up at 3:30, had the shop stove going by 4, had the first 3 heads on the porch bench by 5. She had grown that cabbage from a bed she had double dug in April, 30 rows across the south garden. The plant set out on the 18th of May, in weather that had turned mean the following week, and had nearly taken the whole planting. She had covered every plant by hand with cut squares of muslin against 3 consecutive nights of frost, had gotten up twice each of those nights to check the coverings, had lost 11 plants out of 640. The rest had grown into heads that ran between 5 and 11 pounds by early September, tight and pale and cold at the core. She shredded on the wooden mandolin her mother had used before her, a walnut frame with 3 parallel blades set at a diagonal. The mandolin bolted to the porch bench for the season. She worked in her chore coat with a canvas apron over it, the shredded cabbage falling into a galvanized wash tub between her feet. Every 7 pounds of shredded cabbage got 3 tablespoons of pickling salt worked in with clean hands until the leaves began to weep, packed into a scalded crock. By the double handful, tamped down with the maple pestle. August had turned on the lathe from a piece of hard maple in 1943, weighted with a scalded plate plus a river stone. She sealed each crock with a square of muslin, tied down with jute twine, carried the crock down the outside cellar stairs to the north wall of the root cellar, under the shelf August had built from pine planks in 1939. She worked that way for 4 days. By Thursday evening, the north wall held 11 crocks of cabbage in progress. The cellar had the sharp green smell of cabbage beginning to work. She started the cucumbers on Friday, packed them whole in a brine of 1 cup pickling salt per gallon of water with fresh dill heads from the garden cloves of garlic she had grown from seed stock saved out of the previous year. Half a dozen dried chili pods a woman in Elgin had given her at the September farm sale. Saturday she did green beans, tender young beans, from the second planting, in a brine with dill and a small handful of yellow mustard seed. Sunday she rested. Monday she started beets and vinegar. Tuesday she packed the 5-gallon crock with pork shoulder from the 2 hogs she had butchered the previous November, cured and hung in the smokehouse. Through the winter, sliced now into pieces the size of her hand and layered with coarse salt in a dry cure that would hold the meat through February without any refrigeration at all. The composition book stayed on the kitchen table beside the salt scoop and the paring knife. She entered every crock, every pound of salt, every hour of work in a small, tight column down the left-hand page. In the right-hand column, she noted the source of every ingredient: cabbage from the South Garden, dill from row 9, garlic from the North Bed, salt from George Detweiler's Tuesday delivery. She did not assign a dollar value to her own labor. She had decided long before that hours spent making a family's food out of the ground beneath her feet were not a cost, but an investment, that the alternative, the drive into town, the tin cans off the shelf, the check written to a factory in the state of Illinois, was the thing that deserved a number in the ledger, deserved to be questioned every time it appeared there. By the 1st of November, the root cellar held 31 gallons of fermented and preserved food along the north wall. It held 120 pounds of potatoes in burlap sacks along the west wall. It held 40 pounds of dried navy beans in cotton bags in a barrel. It held 2 salt-cured pork shoulders plus a side of bacon in the 5-gallon crock. It held 12 quarts of lard she had rendered from the October butchering cooling in stoneware jars along the east wall. It held enough food to carry one 31-year-old woman from the middle of November through to the first spring lettuce in April, without a single trip to the grocery store. If that woman was willing to cook, was not particular about variety, was content to eat cabbage in 5 preparations across the winter. Elsa was willing to cook. She was not particular about variety. She was more than content. Thorvald Voss came around the corner of the house on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of November, with the wind out of the northwest and a light dry snow beginning to skiff across the yard. He had come over to borrow a chain binder for a load of oats he was hauling to the elevator the following morning. His own binder was in the shop in Waverly. Having a broken hook replaced, he had remembered that Elsa carried a spare. He had knocked on the front door without any answer. He had walked around the north side of the house toward the shop, thinking to find her there. She was on the back stoop of the kitchen with a 5-gallon crock between her knees and the lid off. Steam rose from the surface of the crock in the cold air. The kitchen door stood open behind her. The smell that met Thorvald at 8 feet away stopped him mid-stride. The smell of cabbage brought to the perfect balance of salt and thyme and cold, sharp and clean and alive. The kind of smell that woke up a memory he had not known he was carrying of his grandmother's cellar in Winnesheek County, when he had been 6 years old and his mother had sent him down to fetch a bowl for the Sunday pork. He stood there with his cap in his hand. Elsa looked up. She did not stop what she was doing, which was ladling sauerkraut out of the crock into a smaller stoneware jar for the coming week's kitchen. "You want the chain binder. It is on the second hook from the left on the north wall of the shop. Bring it back Thursday. There is a coffee pot on the stove if you want a cup before you go." He did not go to the shop right away. He set his cap back on his head. He crossed the yard to the stoop. He crouched down beside the crock. He looked into it for a long moment without saying anything. "How many of these do you have down there?" 11 of cabbage, 5 of cucumbers, 2 of beans, 2 of beets, 1 of the pork, 21 crocks total. 31 gallons of finished capacity. For what? For the winter. Thorvald straightened up slowly. He was a big man, 45 years old that fall, with a face weathered to the color of oiled walnut from 30 summers on an open tractor seat. He had been to the Fenner sale. He had heard the laughter that started there. He had not laughed himself, though he had stood in the crowd while others did, which was, as Elsa had privately determined at the time, roughly the same thing. "My wife has been buying kraut in tins from the store since her mother passed. $1.40 a case. Half of it goes down the sink. That is on account of what they do with the good stuff in the factory. They cook the life out of it to make it keep on a shelf without refrigeration. What comes out the other end will not turn a person's stomach, but it will not do them any particular good either." Thorvald was quiet. The wind moved across the yard. He watched her hand the ladle over the mouth of the crock. He watched her tamp the muslin back down over the surface with the flat of her palm. He watched her set the plate back on top of the muslin, the river stone back on top of the plate, all without spilling a drop or hurrying a single motion. The movements of a person who had learned a process, the way August Halverson had learned his lathe work by doing it enough times that her hands could do it while her mind was somewhere else. How much did those Crocs cost you? $4.50 for the Fenner lot, 60 cents for 3 at the sales I hit last fall, 30 cents for the 2 at the Bremer County dispersal. Add another $1.70 for 4 I picked up in July at the estate sale over east of Fayette. Total investment on stoneware, $6.10. Salt was $3.60 for the first 2 bags. The rest was garden. Thorvald ran a hand along his jaw. He did not speak for another long moment. Then his voice came out lower than it had been. I laughed inside my head at the Fenner sale. Not out loud, but I laughed. I know. I want you to know I understand now that I was laughing at my own ignorance. Not yet, you are not. He looked at her. You will understand when your wife has 30 gallons in her own cellar and knows the difference between what comes out of a crock and what comes out of a tin. Until then, you only understand that I have something you did not think I would have. That is not the same as understanding what I have. Thorvald did not answer that. He went to the shop. He got the chain binder. He walked back across the yard with it over his shoulder. He stopped by the stoop on his way out. You will come by the house Sunday afternoon. My wife's name is Ingrid. She was in the cafe that day. I remember. She has been wanting to speak to you for 6 months. She has not known how to start. Ingrid Voss was at Elsa's kitchen table the following Sunday afternoon with the composition book open between them. Elsa walked her through the columns. She walked her through the arithmetic. She walked her through the difference between a sound crock and a cracked crock that was actually sound. She walked her through the mandolin, the maple pestle, the pine board lids, the river stones from the creek. Ingrid took notes in her own hand on a folded sheet of paper she had brought in her purse. She stayed for 2 hours. She left with a small stoneware jar of Elsa's sauerkraut wrapped in a dish towel to bring home to Thorvald. By the following September, the Voss cellar held 6 crocks. Thorvald had bought all 6 sound at the West Union Hardware from George Detweiler at $1.25 apiece for the 3 gallons and $2.10 for the 5-gallon. A total investment of $9.90 on stoneware that Elsa had matched for $1.60. He had not yet learned that part. That would come later when he had gotten over the initial embarrassment of not knowing what he did not know, when he was ready to ask a second round of questions. Word moved from the Voss kitchen the way word had moved from the Fenner sale, but at a different speed and in a different register. It moved slowly. It moved through wives at first, at church suppers, at the Ladies' Aid meeting, on the second Thursday of the month, in the pickup line at the elementary school. It moved with the weight of specific information, not with the light, easy carrying capacity of a joke. She has 30 gallons down there. She spent $6 on the Crocs. She has not been to the grocery store since the second week of November. By the following spring, the story that had traveled the county in April of 1959 as a piece of entertainment had been quietly overwritten by a different version of itself, and the men at the counter of the 3rd Street Cafe had stopped bringing up the Fenner Crocs, though none of them had ever formally acknowledged that they had stopped. The years that followed came the way years come, on a farm one after the other, each one filled with its own weather and its own prices and its own particular disasters and small graces. Elsa expanded the garden every year for the first 5, then held at 2 acres because she had reached the size she could put up alone in the evenings of September and October without hiring help. She hit every farm dispersal within 70 miles. She bought Crocs at nearly all of them sound ones for a quarter or 50 cents, cracked ones for a nickel or nothing at all. By the fall of 1965, she had 90 gallons of fermentation capacity along the north wall of the cellar at a total investment across 6 years of $22.40. She had stopped tracking the grocery savings in the composition book because the number had become large enough to embarrass the arithmetic. She spent under $40 a year on store food, most of it coffee flour baking powder, the small block of cheddar she permitted herself at Christmas from the creamery in Elgin. The farm ran the way it had always run on the accounts August had established, and the equipment he had left her in the shop that kept the equipment running. She bought a used tractor in 1963 from a farmer near Waverly who was retiring a 1954 Farmall Super M with a factory rebuilt engine for $1,100 in cash. She bought a used baler in 1966 for $400 in cash. She never signed a note. She never carried a payment. The savings account at the Fayette County State Bank grew in careful increments that she entered in the passbook after every quarter, 400, in a modest year, 700 in a good one, 200 the year. The corn broke below $1.40, and the input cost did not correspondingly break. She took the folded paper out of the billfold every April on a Sunday afternoon, after the seed was ordered and before the ground would work, unfolded it refolded it, slid it back behind the library card. She did not add to it. She did not amend it. Some Aprils she read it in less than a minute and put it away without any particular feeling. Other Aprils, she sat with it on her knee for an hour, looking out the south window of the parlor at the fields, still holding their brown, thinking about how far along she was and how far she still had to go, and whether the timeline she had committed herself to in 1959 remained a realistic one. In August of 1964, Fayette County went 11 weeks without rain. It was not the worst drought the county had seen in the 20th century. The summer of 1936 had been worse. The summer of 1934 worse still. But it was the worst drought that anyone under 50 could remember. With any clarity, it broke a certain number of families outright. The corn started to fire in the second week of July. By the end of that week, the leaves along the top third of every stalk in the county had gone from the deep green of a healthy plant to the pale yellow of a plant that was rationing what water it had left. By the third week of July, the firing had moved down the stalk. By the 1st of August, a person driving County Road W14 could see through the tops of the corn from the road right through to the hedgerow on the far side of a 100-acre field because the leaves had shriveled and curled back from the ears and let the sunlight through. Merle Ostergaard had 80 head of Angus cattle on the west side of his operation, a herd he had built up across a decade of careful buying at the Rochester feeder sales. He had run the herd on a rotation of 6 pastures across 240 acres. By the middle of August, 4 of the 6 pastures were bare. The 2 that still had any grass on them had been grazed down to the crown. The stock ponds were mud. The creek that ran the south line of his west place was down to a series of standing puddles between exposed gravel bars. He hauled water in a 1,500-gallon tank behind his pickup for 3 weeks twice a day, then 3 times. Then he did the arithmetic on what the hauling was costing him against what he was going to get for animals that were losing condition in real time. I hauled the whole herd to the Waterloo stockyards on the first Monday of September. The prices he got were in the language of the yard salvage. He came home from Waterloo with a check that did not cover the notes he had signed the previous winter on the cattle themselves, plus the new corral system, plus the 240 acres of West Union pasture he had bought in 1962 at what had seemed like the top of the market at the time. Wendell Detmer had 140 acres of corn along the north bottom of the Volga River, of which perhaps 40 acres had made anything worth harvesting, the rest of it standing in the field in the middle of September as fodder that was not worth the diesel to run the combine through it. He was 35 years old that year. His wife had been unwell through the summer with something the doctor in Allwine had not been able to name, though he had been optimistic about her recovery. Wendell had refinanced the farm in 1961 to cover her medical bills, had assumed the coming years would let him pay down the balance in an orderly way. The drought made that assumption look like it had been made by a different man in a different century. He came over to Elsa's place on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of September in his one clean pair of coveralls with his cap in his hands. He stood at the kitchen door. Elsa let him in. She poured him a cup of coffee. She set out a plate with 2 pieces of the ginger cake she had baked on Sunday from molasses off her own hives flour from the mill and West Union eggs from her 40 hens. She sat down across from him. She waited. Wendell Detmer had the look of a man who had not slept a full night in a month. His hands closed around the coffee cup for warmth, even though the kitchen was warm and the coffee was not particularly hot. When he spoke, his voice was flat, the voice of a man who was working very hard not to let his voice do anything embarrassing. Elsa, I have to ask you something I do not want to ask you. Ask it. I need to borrow $800 until March. I need it to keep the bank off my back until I can get through calving and get some cows sold in the spring. I have no business asking. I understand if you cannot. But there is not another door in this county I can knock on. Whitmore has already turned me down twice. He wants the ground more than he wants the note current. Elsa looked at him. She did not answer for a long moment. She was calculating not the $800 she had that in the passbook 15 times over, but a different calculation entirely. The calculation of what a loan between neighbors did to a friendship over the next 10 years. Even in the best case, what it did in the worst case. I am not going to lend you $800, Wendell. His face did not fall. He had not expected the answer to be different. He nodded once. But I am going to give you two things. I am going to send you home with 20 pounds of the salt-cured pork out of my cellar. That will feed your wife and your two boys for 6 weeks if she is careful, longer if she stretches it. I am going to give you the name of a man in Waverly who buys standing corn for silage from farmers in exactly your situation. He will not offer you a good price. He will offer you a price that lets you cut what is standing before the first hard freeze. It will not solve your problem, but it will get you far enough into December that you can think again. Wendell put his forehead down against his knuckles for a moment. He picked his head back up. Why the pork? Because the difference between borrowing $800 from a neighbor and taking 20 pounds of pork off her cellar wall is the difference between a debt that ends this March and a debt that never ends. I would rather feed you than lend you. I would rather have you owe me a Sunday afternoon of fence work next summer than $800 plus interest of my own making. He nodded slowly. He drank the coffee. He ate one piece of the ginger cake. He carried the 20 pounds of pork home in a burlap sack in the bed of his pickup wrapped in butcher paper Elsa had cut off the roll in her pantry. He called the man in Waverly on Thursday morning. The man came out on Saturday, walked the North Bottom field with Wendell, wrote him a check for $440 for the standing corn. It was not enough to make the bank happy. It was enough to keep the doors from being locked, was enough to buy Wendell another 6 months of not knowing yet whether he was going to make it. The following Sunday afternoon at the 3rd Street Cafe, Merle Ostergaard was in his corner booth again, without the 3 feed dealers with a coffee in front of him he had not touched. I was 50 years old that fall. His face had the puffiness of a man who was drinking more than he had drunk the previous year, though not yet enough to have reached his eyes. When Elsa came through the door in her chore coat with a grocery list in her pocket for the 4 items she still bought at the IGA next door, Ostergaard looked up. He did not stand. He did not raise a cup. What he said in a voice pitched to be heard by his own table, and no farther, though the cafe was quiet enough that most of the room heard it anyway, was not the sort of thing he had said in April of 1959. Halverson was lucky this year. She had a good well. She had the season she had put in ahead of her. Another dry summer next year, and she is on the same road the rest of us are on. The 2 men at the next table did not laugh. One of them turned his head away from Ostergaard. The other looked into his coffee. Marta Kolb, who had been at the counter for the exchange 5 years earlier, set down the pot she was carrying, wiped her hands on her apron. The bell above the door rang as it settled. Elsa did not turn her head. She walked to the counter. She ordered her usual cup. She sat on the 3rd stool from the door. She drank her coffee. She did not respond to what Ostergaard had said in the same way she had not responded 5 years earlier, though, for a different reason. The first time she had not responded because she had understood he wanted a fight, and she had understood the value of denying him one. The second time she did not respond because the room was already denying it for her, because 2 men at a neighboring table who would have laughed in 1959 were now studying their coffee cups, because Merle Ostergaard's own voice had come out at 3/4 volume and had still cleared the room. That was worth more than anything Elsa could have said out loud. She finished her coffee. She left the 35 cents plus the nickel on the counter. She walked out. The following December at the Halverson kitchen table on the 23rd, Elsa's older brother Redar arrived from Cedar Rapids in a Buick Roadmaster with his wife Judith in a mink stole and his son Peter, 15 years old that Christmas, in a wool suit that had been bought for him in a store in Iowa City. Redar had brought a bottle of blended whiskey and a fruitcake in a tin. He had also brought, tucked into the inside pocket of his overcoat, a folded set of papers on the letterhead of an attorney named Blackstone, who had an office on 2nd Avenue Southeast in Cedar Rapids. Elsa did not see the papers on the 23rd. She saw them on the 24th at 10 in the morning in the parlor, after Judith had taken Peter upstairs to look at the room August had used as a study after Redar had cleared his throat twice in the way he cleared his throat when he was going to say something he had been rehearsing. The proposal as Blackstone had drafted it was that Elsa would sell 60 acres off the east side of the home place at fair market value. The proceeds to be divided 3 ways among the surviving Halverson siblings, Redar, the middle brother, in Des Moines, Elsa herself. Redar's stated reasoning was that the farm had appreciated considerably since 1956, that the original inheritance had been divided at the value of that year, that fairness required a revisiting of the numbers. He said all of this in the tone of a man laying out an obvious argument for a person he considered not entirely equipped to appreciate its obviousness. Elsa listened without interrupting. She let him finish. She took the papers from him, read the first page, read the second, folded them, set them on the drum table beside her chair. She got up. She walked into the kitchen. She opened the top drawer of the sideboard. She took out the passbook to the Fayette County State Bank. She walked back into the parlor. She handed the passbook to Rydar. He opened it. He looked at the balance line. He looked up at her. $12,486. Rydar spoke the number in the voice of a man reading a wattage off a light bulb. That is the balance as of the 3rd of December. Every deposit is dated. Every deposit is initialed by whoever posted it. Father's original balance is on the first page dated the day he passed. Every dollar in that book, past $4,218, was put there by me since November of 1956. Elsa, that is not what You want to talk about fairness. Fairness is that Father left each of us a fourth share of the inheritance. Yours was worth $1,050 in 1956. If you had put that money in a savings account, paying 3.25%, which is what this bank paid on demand deposits for the years in question, you would have $1,347 today. I am going to write you a check for $1,347 this morning. That is your fourth share plus what it would have earned if you had banked it. In return, I want a signed release drawn up by any attorney of your choosing at your expense, in which you and Judith and any heirs you may have in the future acknowledge full satisfaction of any claim against this farm or this operation for all time. Rydar's mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. The land is worth what it is worth to a person willing to work it. It is worth nothing to a person sitting in Cedar Rapids drawing a salary from Quaker Oats. If you wanted a share of what this land has become since Father passed, you should have stayed and put a hand on a shovel. You went to Cedar Rapids. That was your choice. I do not begrudge it. But you do not get to come back at Christmas with a lawyer and turn the choice into an investment. She sat down. Rydar stood by the window for a long moment. Judith came down the stairs, sensed the shape of the room, went back up. Peter did not come down at all. Rydar took the check. He signed the release which Elsa had drawn up herself on a single sheet of typewriter paper. He drove out on the 26th with his family in the Buick. He did not come back at Christmas the following year or the year after that, though a card arrived every December from the address in Cedar Rapids, and Elsa sent one back every year, and neither of them ever spoke about the papers again. She learned 6 months later in a way she had not previously suspected that the visit had not been Rydar's own idea. In April of 1965, in the annual meeting of the County Extension Service in West Union, Elsa was seated next to a woman named Della Vocal, whose husband Alfred was on the board of the Fayette County State Bank. Della was 70 years old, was not particularly discreet on the subject of the bank's internal affairs, had never been fond of Clarence Whitmore. Over coffee at the intermission, she leaned toward Elsa and said in the tone of a woman passing along a piece of information she had been carrying for a while and had been waiting for the right moment to unload. Clarence called your brother in Cedar Rapids in November of 1963. Alfred saw the notation in the visitor's log at the bank because Clarence had put it there thinking it was for a business call. Clarence put your brother onto the idea that the Halverson inheritance had been improperly settled and that the family had grounds to reopen it. He offered your brother the bank's assistance in facilitating the sale of any land the family might elect to liquidate. Alfred wanted you to know. Elsa thanked her. Elsa drank her coffee. Elsa drove home in the dark. She did not, as far as any person who knew her could later recall, mention what Della Vocal had told her to another soul that year, or the next, or the one after that. She entered nothing about it in the composition book. What she did do over the course of that spring was study Clarence Whitmore more carefully than she had previously bothered to study him. She began attending the annual meetings of the bank as a depositor with voting rights, which the bank's charter permitted her to do, which she had never previously exercised. She began reading the annual report cover to cover. She began noticing the pattern of foreclosures the bank recorded each year, the names of the families whose ground came onto the market through Whitmore's office, the prices at which that ground was moved. 9 years later, on a Thursday afternoon in the spring of 1974, Clarence Whitmore parked a green Buick Electra in Elsa's yard and got out with a leather folder under his arm. He was 67 years old that April. His silver hair had gone entirely white. He walked with a slight stoop that had not been there the last time Elsa had seen him at the bank. He knocked at the kitchen door. She opened it. She invited him in without any particular warmth or coolness. She poured him a cup of coffee. Us sat at the oak table. He came to the point without any preamble. The bank is prepared to offer you $80,000 in cash for your 160 acres. You would retain the house and the shop plus 5 acres of curtilage. You would have a life estate in the house at no rent. You would have the $80,000 to invest as you saw fit at a rate that would produce a comfortable annual income for a woman of your age with no dependents to consider. Elsa held the coffee cup in both hands. She did not drink from it. You are asking me to sell 155 acres at approximately $500 an acre. $516, which the bank's appraisal supports as a fair number for productive Fayette County ground of your quality. Mr. Whitmore, there was a piece of ground sold by private treaty on the west side of the county 6 weeks ago at $1,100 an acre. There was another piece traded up near Sumner in February at $940. You know both those numbers. You are here today to offer me a little more than half of what my ground would bring at auction on a Saturday morning in June. Whitmore's face did what it had done in his office 15 years earlier, the small tightening around the mouth of a man who had prepared for a different conversation. Miss Halvorson, those prices are not going to hold. There is a correction coming in farmland values. Any competent banker in the state of Iowa will tell you the same. The prices that have been printed at private sales this spring are the last high prices we are going to see for a decade. The bank's offer reflects the value of ground that is going to be worth less every year for the next several years. You would be locking in a favorable exit. Elsa set the coffee cup down. She looked at Whitmore for a long moment across the table. You told me in 1959 that I should sell 40 acres to the bank as collateral. You told me it would be prudent. You told me nobody would be standing behind me if a season went bad. 15 years have passed. I have not had to stand behind me. The land has stood behind itself. If I had listened to you in 1959, I would not own the 40 acres today. I would own no life estate, no house, no shop, no cellar. I would be renting some room in West Union off the interest on a check you would have written me for $8,000 in 1959 that would have been eaten by 15 years of coffee and rent long before this morning. She stood. She walked to the window over the sink. She looked out at the shop, at the smoke coming out of the shop chimney where she had a small fire going against the April chill. You know what you are, Mr. Whitmore. You are a man who has spent 40 years talking widows and unmarried women and old men into arrangements that put their ground into your bank's ledger at prices that no auction house would sanction. You have made your career on the difference between what a piece of ground is worth on a Saturday morning to a room full of bidders and what it is worth on a Tuesday afternoon to a scared woman across a desk from you. I am not scared. I have never been scared. I was not scared of you in 1959. I am not scared of you today. I am going to ask you to finish your coffee. Put your folder back in the trunk of that car, drive off my property, not come back. Whitmore drove off. Elsa watched the Buick out to the county road, watched the dust settle, walked out to the shop, sat down on the stool at August's workbench, took her billfold out of her back pocket. She pulled back the flap of the currency pocket. She slid the folded paper out from behind the library card. She unfolded it. She read it. She refolded it. She put it back. Then she got a pencil and a sheet of paper. She sat at the workbench under the south window in the light that August had built the shop to catch. She wrote in her small, tight hand a set of notes to herself on what Whitmore's visit had told her about what was coming. He had come with an offer 40% below market. He had come with a story about a correction in farmland values. He had come now in the spring of 1974 when the corn was $3.20 a bushel and the ground was moving at $1,100 an acre at auction because he knew something that had not yet been printed in the West Union Fayette County Union or the Des Moines Register or the Wall Street Journal. What he knew was that the bank was positioning itself for something large, something that would depend on picking up quality ground at distressed prices from farmers who would not be able to service the debt they had taken on to buy the ground they were farming. Elsa did not know precisely when it would come. She did not know what would trigger it. She knew sitting on that stool in the April light that Whitmore's visit had been an early tremor of it, that the correct response to an early tremor was not to run outside, but to walk quietly around the house and check every foundation stone. Over the following 5 years, she made a series of small, quiet adjustments that no person outside her kitchen would have noticed. She stopped selling any of her corn at fall prices, put it into the crib for spring delivery when the numbers were higher. She converted $15,000 of the savings account into a certificate of deposit at the Waverly Savings and Loan at 7.75% for 4 years, precisely because she did not want that money sitting in Clarence Whitmore's ledger any longer. She let Ostergaard and Detmer and the other men in the county borrow themselves into the postures they were borrowing themselves into without any comment. She watched the corn price climb through 1975 and 1976. She watched land values climb through 1977. She watched the first crack open in 1979 when the interest rates went above 10% for the first time in her life. She watched them go above 15 in 1981. In August of 1983, the West Union Fayette County Union carried a notice on page 3 of the Wednesday edition. Under the standard heading of Sheriff's Sales in the column for October auctions, a notice appeared for 160 acres of Grand Meadow Township ground being sold at public auction to satisfy a judgment held by the Fayette County State Bank against Wendell and Marion Detmer. Sale to be conducted at the Fayette County Courthouse in West Union on Saturday the 15th of October at 10 o'clock in the morning. Auctioneer of record Palmer Reichelt of Olwine. Officer presiding on behalf of the plaintiff bank Clarence Whitmore. Elsa read the notice at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee at 7:30 on a Wednesday morning. She read it once. She folded the paper. She opened the ledger. She turned to the passbook page. She entered the current balance of the Fayette County State Bank savings account, which the last posting on the 2nd of August had put at $89,248. She entered the balance of the Waverly Savings and Loan CD, which had matured in June, rolled at a rate higher than the original, was now standing at $44,318 with a maturity date in July of 1987. She entered the balance of a smaller passbook at the Farmers Bank in Sumner, $12,140. She entered the value of a Treasury note she had bought in 1978 at a discount, now paying face value plus interest through its full maturity in 1986 at $13,200. She added the column. She checked the sum. She checked it a second time. The number was $158,906 in cash, and cash equivalents, all of it. Hers, none of it borrowed, none of it collateralized, none of it committed to any purpose. She added the $2,500 she kept in a tin box behind the flour canister in the pantry. She added the small amount in her checking account at the West Union Bank. She arrived at $161,400. She got up from the table. She walked to the parlor. She opened the top drawer of the drum table. She took out her billfold. She pulled back the flap of the currency pocket. She slid the folded paper out from behind the library card, which had been renewed 11 times since she had first put the paper there in 1959, which was still a Grundy Center library card in her father's name until 1968, and in her own name since. The paper was worn at the folds. The pencil had faded from black to a dark gray, to a paler gray, though every word was still legible. She unfolded it. She read what she had written on that Wednesday evening in April of 1959. She got a pencil from the drawer. She sharpened it with the small penknife August had carried in his vest pocket, which she now carried in her apron pocket. Under the last line of the original writing, in the small tight hand that had not changed in 24 years, she wrote a single word. Enough. She folded the paper. She put it back behind the library card. She closed the billfold. She set the billfold on the drum table. She stood in the parlor in the morning light for a long moment, looking out the south window at the fields that were her fields, at the fields across the road that would come to auction in 10 weeks, at the road that led from her yard past the Voss place, past the Detmer place, past the Ostergaard place, all the way into West Union, to the corner of Vine Street, where a 2-story brick building with a Palladian window on the second floor housed the office of a man who did not yet know what was going to happen on the morning of the 15th of October. She had 6 weeks to prepare. She did not need 6 weeks. She was already prepared. Between the notice on that Wednesday morning and the sale on Saturday, 6 weeks later, the Waverly CD paid a quarterly interest posting that added another $800 to the cash column, and Elsa arranged with the Waverly manager to break a smaller certificate she had bought the previous spring, taking the penalty on the interest, but freeing an additional $14,000 into the demand account, which brought her total available cash on the morning of the 15th of October when she wrote the check to $176,200 sufficient by a margin of $200 for what she intended to spend. She went back to the kitchen. She poured a third cup of coffee. She sat down. She looked at the notice on page 3 of the paper. The line of morning light coming through the east window fell across the printed page, across the name of Wendell Detmer, across the name of Clarence Whitmore, across the date of Saturday the 15th of October, 1983. She did not smile. She did not frown. Her face was as still as the face of a woman studying a weather report, though what she was studying was not weather. Outside in the shop across the yard, 90 gallons of stoneware stood in a row along the north wall, most of it packed already with the cabbage and cucumber and beet and green bean crop of a summer that had gone. The way summers went, 24 of the 90 crocks, having come originally out of a crate behind Otto Fenner's corn crib in April of 1959, each one still in service, each one paid for once 24 years ago, in the coin of a woman who had understood what she was buying, while 40 men laughed at her for not understanding it. She drank the coffee. She put the cup in the sink. She went outside to finish the morning chores. Saturday, October 15th, 1983, broke gray over Fayette County with a low ceiling of iron-colored cloud that had rolled in overnight from the Dakotas and looked as if it intended to sit down through the weekend. The temperature at 4 in the morning stood at 41 degrees on the thermometer mounted outside Elsa Halverson's kitchen window. She was up by 3:40. She had the coffee on by 4. She was dressed by 4:15 in her Sunday coat over a navy blue work dress, her hair pinned tight, a pair of low-heeled leather shoes she had owned since 1974 and had polished the night before with a rag out of the shop. She did not eat breakfast. She was not hungry. She poured a second cup, sat at the oak table by the south window, opened the composition book to a fresh page. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote a single line beneath it. Sale of the Detmer Place, 160 acres, Grand Meadow Township Courthouse, steps 10 o'clock. She closed the book. At 6, she went out to the shop, checked the wood stove, banked the coals down to a slow burn that would hold until noon. She stood for a moment at the workbench under the south window in the pre-dawn dark, her hand resting on the edge of the oak surface August had built out of the windstorm barn lumber in 1941. She did not speak out loud. She did not need to. The shop held its old silences, the way the cellar held its crocks, in their proper places, in their proper counts. At 7, she carried out to the truck a leather satchel she had bought secondhand at an estate sale in 1971 for $1.25, which she had used ever since, to carry documents to town. Inside the satchel were 3 items. The first was a manila envelope holding the deed to her 160 acres. The released reader had signed 20 years earlier the last 2 annual reports of the Fayette County State Bank. The second was a checkbook to the Waverly Savings and Loan account, which had been funded that Wednesday by wire transfer against the matured CD from June. The third was the leather billfold she had carried since 1954, with the folded paper still behind the library card, the pencil words she had added 6 weeks earlier, still fresh on the paper. She started the Ford at 7:15. She drove into West Union. By 9:30, the north lawn of the Fayette County Courthouse held perhaps 200 more people than had been present at any sheriff's sale in the county in the memory of any of them, because the Detmer Place was the 12th farm to come to auction in Fayette County in 11 months, because everybody in the county was doing the arithmetic on the difference between what land had been worth in 1979 and what it was going to bring off the courthouse steps that morning. Trucks lined both sides of North Vine Street for 3 blocks. The wind had risen with the sun. Men stood in small clusters with their hands in the pockets of their coats, their caps pulled low, their conversations carried on at a volume Elsa had come to recognize across 4 years of these mornings, the low tone of men watching something they could not stop. Palmer Reichelt was set up on the courthouse steps with a portable oak lectern he had used for 40 years. His clipboard braced against the lectern in the wind. He was 71 years old that October. His face was redder than it had been when he had called the Fenner sale in the spring of 1959. His hands were steadier than a man his age had any right to hope for. Beside the lectern on a folding chair sat Clarence Whitmore, 76 that April, in a black overcoat over a gray suit, a Homburg pulled low against the wind, a leather portfolio across his lap containing the papers of the transaction. Beside Whitmore stood a younger man in a topcoat, the bank's attorney down from Waterloo, whose name Elsa did not know, whose expression across the entire proceeding suggested a man who had been asked to attend a wedding for a couple he had not previously met. Wendell Detmer stood at the far corner of the north lawn near the elm tree that had come up in 1902 out of a seed a courthouse janitor had planted the year Theodore Roosevelt took office. Detmer was 54 that fall. His wife Marion stood beside him in her Sunday coat, her hand in the crook of his elbow. Their two boys, both of them men in their 20s by then, one working in Rochester, Minnesota, one in Mason City, stood a respectful distance behind their parents. Detmer had his hat in his hand. He did not turn his head when other men in the crowd looked in his direction. I was not present as a bidder. He was present because a farm his grandfather had homesteaded in 1884 was being sold out from under his family that morning, and he had decided that whatever else happened, he was going to stand on the same piece of ground while it happened. Elsa parked the Ford on 3rd Street a block off the square. She walked the block with her satchel in her right hand, her purse in her left. She did not stop to speak to any of the men who nodded to her as she came. She took a position toward the back of the crowd on the sidewalk that ran along the east side of the lawn, the same spatial position she had taken 24 years earlier at the Fenner sale south of West Union, because that was where a person could see everything without being seen. 20 feet to her right stood Thorvald Voss in the same wool overcoat he had worn to every sheriff's sale of that year, his cap in his hand, his eyes on the lectern. He gave her a single nod. She returned it. Palmer Reichelt tapped the clipboard against the lectern to bring the lawn to order. He read the legal description of the property in the flat cadence auctioneers used for the required language, took the crowd through the terms. Cash sale 10% down at the fall of the hammer balance. Within 30 days, warranty deed to be delivered upon full payment sale, subject to confirmation by the court within 10 days. He read the opening bid figure the bank had established as the reserve. $600 an acre. Do I have 600? Man Elsa did not recognize, in a fawn-colored topcoat cut in a Des Moines style, raised his hand at the front of the crowd. That was the land investment company Iowa Ag Holdings out of Polk County, which had picked up 4 farms in the county across the summer at prices between $550 and $720 an acre. 600 to the gentleman on my left. Do I have 650? The bid went to 650 from a farmer standing at the edge of the crowd near the driveway, a man from Bremer County named Ivar Solheim, whose operation had come through the crisis intact because he had followed the same pattern of no borrowing his own father had modeled through the 1930s. Solheim was 58, wearing a barn coat he had owned since Elsa's father was alive, one of the few men present who was there as a buyer in cash rather than as a spectator. 650 from the tall gentleman. 700, do I hear 7? The Des Moines man took it to 700 without any hesitation. Solheim went to 750. The Des Moines man went to 775. Solheim went to 800. The Des Moines man paused. He looked over his shoulder at a second man from the same company standing 3 paces behind him. The second man gave a small shake of the head. The Des Moines man dropped out at 800. Palmer Reichelt's cadence quickened by a quarter beat. 800 to the gentleman from Bremer. Do I hear 850? A third bidder came in at 850 from the middle of the crowd, a man in a camel hair coat whose face Elsa did not recognize, but whom she understood the moment he spoke, because his voice carried the tempered smoothness of a man who was not there for himself. He was Kenneth Preisker, president of the First State Bank of West Union, which was the other bank in town, a smaller institution across the square from Whitmore's. I was bidding as everyone in the crowd, who had been paying attention across the previous 4 years, stood on behalf of an undisclosed client. What most people in the crowd did not know what Elsa had learned 2 weeks earlier from Della Vocal over coffee at a Ladies' Aid luncheon was that the undisclosed client was Clarence Whitmore himself. Operating through a shell corporation, his son-in-law had registered in Delaware in 1978, precisely to allow this sort of transaction without the appearance of impropriety on the record of the plaintiff bank. Ivar Solheim took it to 900. Kenneth Preisker did not immediately respond. He glanced back toward the folding chair where Whitmore sat with his hands folded on the portfolio. Whitmore gave a small nod. Preisker raised his index finger to Palmer. 900 to Bremer, do I hear 950? 950. Solheim did not respond. He had reached his ceiling. He looked at the ground for a moment. He looked up at Palmer Reichelt. He shook his head once, a small controlled motion. 950 on the table. 950 going once. The crowd made the small collective sound, a crowd makes when it senses a proceeding is about to end. 950 going. Elsa raised her hand. 1,000. 200 heads turned at once because the voice had come from where no bidder had been standing, from the sidewalk at the back of the east side of the lawn, from a woman in a Sunday coat with a leather satchel in her right hand, whom half the crowd had not registered as being present, whom the other half had registered but had not counted, because in 24 years of estate and sheriff's sales in Fayette County, no woman had ever raised a hand in a serious bid on farmland. Palmer Reichelt found her with his eyes. His face did the small work of a man recalibrating a proceeding on the fly. 1,000 from Miss Halverson on my right. Do I hear 1050? Kenneth Priesker's face did not change. He looked over his shoulder at Clarence Whitmore. Whitmore, for the first time that morning, was no longer expressionless. His mouth had opened by perhaps a quarter of an inch. The Homburg cast a shadow across the top half of his face, but his lower jaw was visible, and his lower jaw had gone slack in a way that a man in his position ought not to have permitted himself to display. He recovered inside of 2 seconds. He gave Priesker a small, tight nod. 1050. 1050 on the table. Do I hear 1100 from the lady? Elsa did not raise her hand. She did not need to raise her hand. She spoke in a voice pitched no louder than the wind that carried across the lawn, as if the lawn had been engineered specifically to conduct her voice from the back to the front. 1100. Priesker looked at Whitmore again. Whitmore's mouth was closed now. His eyes had gone from surprise to something more calculating, the eyes of a man doing arithmetic in his head at the speed his position required. He was calculating. Elsa understood not whether Elsa Halverson could actually deliver on a bid at that price, but whether the bank's shell corporation could go higher without exposing the transaction to the sort of scrutiny that would end Clarence Whitmore's career at the age of 76. The corporation had been established with a ceiling of $175,000, which at 160 acres worked out to a per-acre ceiling of $1093. Whitmore had already exceeded it by $7 an acre in his last nod to Priesker. He could not, on the record of a sheriff's sale attended by 200 witnesses, exceed it further. He gave Priesker a small shake of the head. Priesker did not raise his finger. He turned back toward the lectern. He looked at Palmer Reichelt. He did nothing. 1100 on the table. Do I hear 1150? 1100 going once. 1100 going twice. The crowd made no sound. 200 people held 200 breaths because 200 people had understood in the span of 40 seconds that a woman most of them had laughed at, across the counter of the 3rd Street Cafe in the spring of 1959, was about to write a check for $176,000 on a Saturday morning in the fall of 1983 to buy the farm of a neighbor whose grandfather had homesteaded the ground before her own father had been born. Sold to Miss Elsa Halverson of Grand Meadow Township. 160 acres at $1,100 an acre. $176,000. The hammer fell. The lawn did not erupt. It did the opposite of erupt. It became so quiet that a person could hear the wind moving through the branches of the courthouse. Elm could hear the flag on the pole above the north entrance, snapping against the metal fastener, could hear a car turn onto Vine Street 2 blocks north and pass along the square without stopping. The quiet held for perhaps 8 full seconds. Then it broke not into cheering, but into a low, sustained murmur that moved through the crowd the way the laughter had moved through the crowd at the Fenner sale at the same latitude of sound in the exact opposite register. Elsa walked forward. The crowd parted for her without any word from anyone. She walked up the flagstone path to the courthouse steps. Palmer Reichelt was waiting with his clipboard, his face carrying an expression Elsa had not seen on him in the 11 times she had watched him call a sale. Over the years, the expression of a man who had just presided over something he was going to remember for the rest of his working life. He extended his hand. She took it. His grip was steady. Miss Halverson, if you would step this way, we will process the down payment. Balance due within 30 days per the terms. She followed him to a small folding table that had been set up on the courthouse porch under the overhang out of the wind. Clarence Whitmore had risen from his folding chair. He stood by the table with the leather portfolio across his forearms. The attorney from Waterloo stood beside him with a fountain pen already uncapped. Behind Whitmore on the other side of the porch railing, Wendell Detmer stood with his hat in his hand, his eyes on Elsa. Marion Detmer had a hand pressed to her mouth. Their 2 boys were farther back on the lawn, standing very still. Elsa opened the satchel. She took out the checkbook. She set it on the table. She did not sit down. Whitmore did not sit down. Neither of them looked at the other. She opened the checkbook to a blank check. She uncapped her own pen, which was August's fountain pen from the vest pocket, which she had refilled with fresh ink the evening before. She wrote the date. She wrote the name of the payee, which was the Fayette County Sheriff per the terms of the sale. She wrote the amount $17,600, which was the 10% down. She wrote the words in the line below. She signed her name. She tore the check along the perforation. She handed the check across the table to the attorney from Waterloo, because handing it to Whitmore would have required looking at Whitmore, and she was not looking at Whitmore. The attorney took the check. He looked at it. He looked at the drawer bank, which was Waverly Savings and Loan, not Fayette County State. He looked up at Elsa. He looked at Whitmore. Whitmore extended his hand for the check without a word. The attorney placed it in his palm. Whitmore looked at it. He looked at the amount. He looked at the drawer bank a second time. His face did the small, controlled work of a man who was being asked to countersign on behalf of the plaintiff bank an instrument drawn on a competitor bank in the amount of the down payment on a piece of ground his own shell corporation had failed to acquire because his shell corporation had a ceiling it could not exceed. His hand did not shake in any way that a person at a distance would have noticed. His hand did, at the moment he reached for the second fountain pen on the table to countersign the check, as required by the bank's role in the transaction, tremble along the wrist joint in a small, controlled arc that anyone at the table could see clearly, and that at least 4 people in the crowd noticed from the porch railing, and that Wendell Detmer noted with an expression that did not become a smile, because he was not the sort of man who would have smiled at that moment, but that did, for the length of a single breath, allow the tightness around his eyes to relax by a small, measurable amount. Whitmore signed. He handed the check to Palmer Reichelt. Palmer entered it in his register. He tore off a receipt. He handed the receipt to Elsa. She folded it. She placed it in the satchel. Wendell Detmer stepped forward. He had crossed the lawn while she was writing the check. He stood now at the corner of the porch near the railing, his hat in both hands in front of him. I was 10 feet from her. Elsa. She turned. She waited. His voice was low-pitched for her ears and not for the crowd's. Though the porch was quiet enough that Whitmore heard, though the attorney heard, though Palmer heard, though the 6 or 8 men closest to the porch on the lawn side heard. Your father would have understood this. She did not answer right away. She looked at Wendell Detmer for a long moment. She looked at Marion beside him. She looked past them at the elm tree on the north lawn. Yes, Wendell, my father would have understood every part of it. She stepped down off the porch. She walked back across the lawn toward 3rd Street. She did not stop to speak to anyone. Thorvald Voss fell in beside her at the sidewalk without any word. He walked with her the full block to the truck. He waited while she opened the door, set the satchel on the passenger seat. Then he spoke in a voice quieter than the wind, but clear enough that she heard every syllable across the truck cab. I want to ask you something I have been carrying for 24 years. She rested her hand on the doorframe. Ask it. How much of what happened on that porch back there started in the crate of Crocks at Fenner's? She thought about it. She had known this question was coming, had thought about the answer through several long evenings in September, had rehearsed nothing because rehearsing would have made it come out wrong. More than a person would think, Thorvald. Not the money directly. The money came from the years, but the way of looking at things came out of that crate. Once you decide you are going to find the cheapest path between what already exists and what you actually need, you start seeing that path everywhere. The Crocks were where I started practicing. The Detmer ground today was the same skill. 24 years apart, but the same skill. Thorvald pushed his cap up an inch on his forehead. He looked at the ground for a moment. He looked back at her. I laughed at those Crocks, Elsa. Not out loud, but I laughed inside my head, which comes to the same thing. You told me that in 1959 on my back stoop over a 5-gallon crock of cabbage. I told you then you would understand later. I did not know it would take 24 years. I do not think it took 24. I think I understood by 1962. I have just been waiting for a day when saying it out loud would mean something more than a private embarrassment. You lent me a chain binder in November of 1959. You never asked for it back. I still have it. It is on the second hook from the left on the north wall of the shop, where it has been for 24 years. I forgot about it. I know. His face did something that was not quite a smile, but that was more than the face he had brought to the sale, that was in the small register in which men of Thorvald Voss's generation permitted their faces to do such things, the closest a man of that generation could publicly come to a smile of relief. You keep the binder, Elsa. It has been on that hook long enough that it belongs there. She got into the truck. She started the engine. She drove home the long way out east on Highway 18 north on County Road W14 past the Detmer place, where a sold sign already stood at the driveway past the Voss place, where Ingrid was at the mailbox, and raised a hand as Elsa passed. Elsa raised a hand back. She turned into her own drive at 11:20. She parked the Ford. She sat in the cab for a full minute with her hands on the steering wheel, the same way she had sat in the cab in front of the bank in April of 1959, in a different truck, in a different coat, in a different life, that was somehow still the same life. Then she got out. She carried the satchel into the house. She hung her coat on the peg by the door. She sat down at the kitchen table. She opened the composition book. She wrote 3 lines under the line she had entered that morning at 4 o'clock. Purchase confirmed. 160 acres Grand Meadow Township at $1,100 per acre. Down payment made this morning by check on Waverly Savings and Loan. Balance due by November 14th. She closed the book. She put the coffee on. 3 days later, on Tuesday afternoon, Elsa was in the shop grinding the edge of a plowshare when a green Buick Electra came up the drive. The car was not the same Buick Whitmore had driven in 1974. It was newer, though not new. Elsa set the shear down. She wiped her hands on the shop rag. She walked out to the yard. Whitmore did not get out of the car. He rolled down the driver's window. His face was gray. He had not shaved that morning, which for Whitmore was a departure from 40 years of practice. Miss Halverson, I will not take your time. I came to say one thing. She waited. The bank's board met yesterday afternoon in special session. I have tendered my resignation effective the end of the month. There will be an announcement in the paper on Friday. I did not want you to read it there without having heard it first from me. Elsa did not answer for a moment. She looked past the Buick at the shop, at the composition book she had left on the workbench, at the row of stoneware along the north wall of the shop that she had brought up from the cellar that morning to empty in preparation for the fall packing. I appreciate you telling me, Mr. Whitmore. I will not ask you why the board met. You do not need to. You know why. I know what I have been told by people who have no reason to lie to me. I do not know what is in the board's minutes. The minutes will not survive the transition. The reason will. She nodded once. He put the Buick in reverse. He did not offer to shake her hand. He backed down the drive. He did not turn the car around in the yard, which would have required getting out to see behind him, would have required an extra 30 seconds in her presence. He backed the length of the drive to the road. He turned onto the road. He drove west toward West Union. Elsa watched the Buick out to the county line. She turned around. She walked back to the shop. She picked up the plowshare. She resumed grinding the edge. She learned 2 months later in a piece of information that traveled the county through the same channels. The story of the 1959 Crocks had once traveled, that Whitmore had moved to a small town in eastern Nebraska, where a nephew of his had bought a farm implement dealership, that he was reportedly spending his time keeping the dealership's books. The Fayette County State Bank had appointed a new branch officer, a woman in her early 40s named Grace Onimus, who had come up through the loan department at the parent bank in Waterloo, who Elsa met once at the annual depositors meeting in the spring of 1984, and formed the immediate impression of as a person who would call a mortgage foreclosure straight, without any positioning, without any shell corporations. That was the last significant transaction Elsa Halverson had with the Fayette County State Bank in the 20th century, though she remained a depositor there for the rest of her life. At balances that grew each year in the same careful increments the account had always grown by. The following March, on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of the month, Elsa was in the kitchen putting up quarts of applesauce from the previous fall's crop when a black Ford pickup came up the drive. She did not recognize the pickup. She wiped her hands on the apron and went to the door. At the kitchen door stood Merle Ostergaard. He was 70 years old that March. His face was thinner than it had been the last time Elsa had seen him, which had been the previous summer at a distance across the parking lot of the West Union Farm Bureau. He wore a Mackinaw coat that had seen better winters. He held his cap in both hands in front of him, in the same posture Wendell Detmer had held his hat at the courthouse in October. He did not step onto the stoop. Miss Halverson, I do not want to come in. I want to say something at the door, if you will let me. She held the door. Say it. They took the 600 acres last week. Judge signed the order Monday. I have 30 days on the house. Elsa waited. I did not come to ask you for anything. I came to say two things, one that is mine to say, one that is not mine to say, but that I am going to say anyway. The first is that I was wrong at the cafe in 1959, and I have been wrong every year since, to a different degree. I do not expect that to matter to you. I am telling you because it matters to me to have said it out loud to your face. She did not answer. The second is that Marion Detmer sends her thanks. She said to tell you the pork you sent by Ingrid Voss in November of 1964 kept her boys fed through the worst winter that family ever had. She said she knew where it came from at the time, but she never said it out loud to anyone until last month at the church. She said to tell you she has said it now to enough people that you should hear it once from a person who was there when you sent it. Elsa looked at Merle Ostergaard for a long moment across the doorway. She looked at the Mackinaw, at the cap in his hands, at the pickup in the drive, at the thin winter light on the north side of the house. Wait here. She closed the door. She walked to the pantry. She lifted a wrapped bundle off the top shelf, 12 pounds of salt-cured pork she had wrapped in butcher paper the previous Sunday for her own coming week. She carried it to the door. She opened the door. She handed the bundle out to Merle Ostergaard. For your wife, not for you. For your wife and for whatever cellar the two of you land in when the 30 days are up. Take it home. Do not thank me. Do not come back. He took the bundle. He held it against his chest under one arm. His mouth worked for a moment as if he was going to speak. He did not speak. He turned. He walked to the pickup. He set the bundle on the passenger seat. He got in. He drove out. She closed the door. She stood for a moment with her hand on the doorframe. She went back to the applesauce. She did not mention the visit to another person in the county for the rest of her life. Marta Kolb at the 3rd Street Cafe learned about it the following week from Ingrid Voss, who had gotten a version of it from Marion Detmer over the phone, who had gotten it from Merle himself, who was in the fall of his own life, a different man from the one who had stood in the corner booth of the cafe with a coffee cup raised toward a woman he had thought was easy to laugh at. Marta wrote nothing on her chalkboard about it. Marta simply, the next time Elsa came in for a slice of pie on a Sunday morning, did not charge her for the pie, did not accept the nickel. Elsa left on the counter, pushed the nickel back across the counter with a look Elsa understood without a word being exchanged. Karen Halverson came back to Fayette County in the second week of June 1987 in a used Chevy Nova she had bought with her own savings from 3 years of waiting tables in Cedar Rapids, with 2 cardboard boxes of belongings in the back seat and a duffel bag on the floor of the passenger side. She was 19 years old. She was the only daughter of Radar Halverson and Judith. She had spent 1 year at Kirkwood Community College studying accounting and had come to the conclusion over the course of that year that the life she was preparing herself for was not the life she wanted to be prepared for. She pulled into her aunt's drive at 11 in the morning. She got out. She walked to the kitchen door. Elsa was standing at the door, already in an apron with her sleeves rolled up, having heard the Chevy come up the drive. Karen did not speak for a moment. She had not seen her aunt in 8 years, since the summer of 1979 when Judith had brought her out for a week at the age of 11. She had grown 8 inches since then. She had cut her hair short. She was thinner than she had been. Aunt Elsa, Father does not know I am here. Elsa held the door open. Come inside, I have coffee on. We will call your father this evening. Karen stayed. Judith and Radar drove up from Cedar Rapids the following Saturday, sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours, went home. Karen remained. She moved her boxes into the upstairs bedroom that had been Elsa's own room in the years August was alive. She began that first Monday at 4 in the morning, following her aunt out to the barn for the morning chores. Elsa did not lecture her. She did not that first week or the second or the third tell Karen anything about the Fenner Crocks or the Detmer sale or any of what had happened in the years between them. She put a hand on her niece's shoulder in the shop on the second Wednesday and set her at the lathe. She showed her how to chuck a piece of white oak. She showed her how to true it. She showed her how to hold the gouge against the tool rest at the correct angle to remove wood in a clean, continuous shaving. Karen cut into her thumb the third time she tried it. Elsa handed her a piece of clean muslin from the drawer. She did not say anything about being careful. Karen wrapped her thumb. She went back to the lathe. By August, Karen was running the mandolin at the porch bench alongside her aunt during the cabbage packing. By October, she had shredded and salted and packed 6 of the crocks by herself from head to sealed muslin, under Elsa's eye but without Elsa's hands. By the following spring, she had begun to keep her own column in the composition book in a handwriting that resembled her aunt's, the way the handwriting of a person copying from a model resembles the model precise but her own. She turned 25 in June of 1993. By then, she was running the operation alongside Elsa in a way that had gradually shifted across a year. Elsa could not have identified the beginning of from Elsa deciding what would be planted where, and Karen executing to Karen deciding what would be planted where, and Elsa nodding at the plan or on rare occasions suggesting one small adjustment. The land Elsa had bought at the Whitmore sale had gone into corn on a 2-year rotation with soybeans since 1985. The 80 acres Elsa had picked up at a distress sale in Bremer County in 1986 had gone into hay and pasture because Karen at 19 had suggested during her first fall on the farm that a small herd of Angus crossbreds would suit the ground better than another rotation of row crops, and Elsa had considered the suggestion for 2 weeks and had agreed. Karen asked her aunt about the Cracked Crocks for the first time in the fall of 1990 during a Sunday afternoon in October, when the two of them were down in the cellar checking the fermentation on the new season's cabbage. They were standing at the north wall in the low yellow light of the single bulb that hung from the joist above. Karen had a hand on the shoulder of one of the original Cracked Crocks, the 3-gallon with the hairline that had not worsened in 31 years. "Aunt Elsa, this is one of them, isn't it?" "Yes, that is one of the 6 from the crate." "You were 31. I was 31. What did you actually see standing there in that mud that day when you looked at them?" Elsa thought about it. She had been asked a version of the question by Thorvald Voss on 3rd Street after the Whitmore sale had given a version of the answer then. She had never been asked it by a member of her own family. Radar had never asked. Judith had never asked. Peter had never asked. The nieces and nephews at the Cedar Rapids branch of the family who wrote Christmas cards for the sake of writing them had never asked. Karen was the first person who had ever asked, as if she was going to weigh the answer against the life she was going to live. "I saw 30 gallons of fermentation capacity for $4.50. I saw a winter of food. I saw the grocery money going into a bank account instead of going out to a factory in the state of Illinois. That was the first layer of it. That is what I could have said out loud that afternoon if any person there had asked me." Not one person asked. What was the second layer? The second layer took a while to find words for. What I was seeing, if I had known how to say it then, was that most of the value in the world is sitting in plain view being classified as garbage by people who have stopped looking at it. Every field, every barn loft, every estate sale behind every dead farmer's house, every bank ledger if you know how to read one. The value is already there. What is scarce is not the value. What is scarce is the person willing to see it after every other person has stopped seeing it. That person can walk through the county, picking up ground and stoneware, and rendered lard and salvaged oak, spending nothing but her attention, and end up 35 years later owning a life that could not have been bought for any sum of money by any person who was not willing to see. Karen ran her thumb along the hairline in the crock. She did not speak for a long moment. "How do you get to be that person, Aunt Elsa? Where does it start?" "It starts with a man in a shop with a lathe and a saying about earning things twice, if you are lucky. It starts with a father who tells you at 6 years old that what somebody else cannot use, and you can, is the same as money. It starts with sitting on a stool, watching him turn a piece of maple into a pestle you will still be using 70 years later. If you did not have that, I do not know where it starts. But you did have that in a way because your father had it, whether or not he passed it along, whether or not he ever took a piece of oak off a lathe in his life. I knows it. Everything he did in Cedar Rapids was a decision not to do it. That is a kind of knowing. You can start from that." Karen was quiet again. Then she said something that Elsa would remember for the rest of her life, that she wrote down in the composition book that evening in a single line under the day's entry. "I want to be the person who walks through the county seeing what other people have stopped seeing. I want to teach my own children to see it. I do not know if I can do it, but I want to try." Elsa looked at her niece across the top of the crock. She did not smile. She nodded once. "You will try. That is what starting is." They finished checking the crocks. They went back upstairs. In the spring of 1991, on the second Tuesday of April, Elsa spoke at the annual meeting of the Fayette County Farm Bureau at the Community Center in West Union. She had not spoken at any public gathering in her life. The county extension agent, a young man named Cyrus Reinke, who had grown up on a farm south of Waverly and who had made a point of driving out to Elsa's place 3 separate times over the previous 6 months, had asked her to speak. She had said no twice. She had said yes the third time because Cyrus Reinke had begun the third conversation by saying in a tone that surprised her by its directness that there were 17 young farmers in Fayette County who needed to hear from one person who had come through the last decade with something intact, that she was the only person in the county whose story fit the description. She stood at the podium in a dark green dress she had made herself in 1978. She was 63 years old. Her hair had gone white at the temples, but was otherwise still the color of pale straw. She held no notes. She had rehearsed nothing. The room was full. Thorvald Voss was in the second row with Ingrid beside him. Wendell Detmer, now 62, was in the third row with his youngest son. Karen was in the back, with her hand on the top rail of a folding chair in a work shirt she had come from the field in an hour earlier. Kenneth Preisker of the First State Bank sat in the fifth row. Grace Onimus of the Fayette County State Bank sat 2 seats away from him. The room held perhaps 140 people. Elsa did not clear her throat. She did not begin with a joke. She looked out over the room past the front rows to the back wall. A farm that is paid for, in a cellar that is full, are the 2 things a bank cannot take from you. Everything else is borrowing time. You can borrow that time from a bank, or you can borrow it from what you would otherwise have been putting into your own future. Either way, you are borrowing. The only question a person has to answer sitting at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening in April, with the seed order in front of them and the ledger open, is whether the thing they are borrowing against is real. She paused. She did not shift her weight. She did not adjust her hands on the podium. In the spring of 1959, I borrowed against a crate of cracked stoneware that a good many people in this room found funny. I borrowed against a 5-cent composition book from the drugstore. I borrowed against my father's tools and 38 years of what he had learned and never written down. I did not know at the time whether what I was borrowing against would prove to be enough. I hoped it would. I did not know. She looked at Wendell Detmer. She looked at Thorvald Voss. She looked briefly at the back of the room where Karen was standing. It turned out to be enough. Not because I was smart. Not because I worked harder than any of you have worked. Because I was borrowing against something that was already there, that any of us could have borrowed against, that most of us did not, that some of us are still not too old to start borrowing against tomorrow morning. That is all I came here to say. She stepped away from the podium. The room did not applaud immediately. Come. It did the same thing the courthouse lawn had done in October of 1983. It went quiet for a long, slow beat. Then it began to applaud, and the applause held, and Elsa stood at the side of the podium, looking at her hands until Cyrus Reinke came up and took her elbow and walked her back to her chair. Thorvald Voss caught her at the coffee urn after the room had begun to break up. He stood beside her while she poured a cup. He waited until she had capped the sugar shaker. You told me 24 years ago on the sidewalk on 3rd Street that you understood everything my face was doing. I am going to tell you now that I have understood every year since exactly what I was watching. I do not need to say it again after tonight. You do not need to say it at all, Thorvald. You never did. You lent me a chain binder. His mouth did the thing it had done in the fall of 1983, that near smile a man of his generation permitted himself. He picked up his own cup. He went to find Ingrid. Karen drove her aunt home that night in the Chevy Nova, which was 10 years older now, which was on its 2nd set of tires. They did not talk on the drive. When they pulled into the yard, Elsa did not go directly into the house. She walked out to the shop, opened the door, turned on the single bulb. Karen followed her. The row of stoneware stood along the north wall in the yellow light. 24 of the crocks, worn and scoured and repaired across 32 years of continuous seasonal service, sat in the same order they had sat in since 1962, when Elsa had finished setting up the current wall arrangement. The 3-gallon with the hairline was second from the left. The 5-gallon with the pine lid was 4th. The 2-gallon with the wire handle was 7th. The 1-gallon with the tar repair was 9th. The tar had darkened to a color almost indistinguishable from the salt glaze itself, though it was still there, still holding, still a feature and not a flaw. Elsa walked to the workbench under the south window. She sat down on the stool. She took her billfold out of her apron pocket. She pulled back the flap of the currency pocket. She slid the folded paper out. She unfolded it in front of Karen under the bulb. Karen read it. She read the original pencil in Elsa's small, tight hand from 1959. She read the single word Elsa had added under it in the fall of 1983. She looked up at her aunt. "Aunt Elsa, may I keep this?" "Not yet. You will keep it later. When later comes, you will know." "How will I know?" "You will have written something like it yourself. You will fold it up. You will put it behind whatever you carry that a library card would go behind. You will take mine out one Sunday afternoon in April, when your own paper is enough of a thing to be carried alongside mine, when the two of them together will fit in the same pocket, without either one of them being embarrassed by the other. That is how you will know." Karen looked at the paper for a long moment. She looked at the crocks along the north wall. She looked at the lathe in the corner, the drill press, the workbench, the south window that would catch the first light of the following morning. She handed the paper back. Elsa folded it. She slid it behind the library card. She closed the billfold. She put the billfold in her apron pocket. She stood up from the stool. The two of them turned off the bulb. They walked across the yard to the kitchen door in the dark. The wind had gone out of the sky. The stars had come out over Fayette County the way they came out every clear April night in the same quantities and the same positions they had held over that stretch of Iowa black dirt for as long as any Halverson had been buried in the county cemetery. Elsa opened the door. Karen followed her inside. The kitchen was warm. The composition book was open on the table. The coffee pot was cold on the stove. Elsa closed the door.